The rain battered the roof of the diner, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the world beyond the fogged-up windows. I was alone, or felt like it, until Ethan slid into the booth across from me, his leather jacket slick with rain and his eyes carrying a storm of their own. "You look like you could use some company," he said, voice low, but the way he looked at me like he could see every crack in my soul made my heart lurch. I'd known Ethan for years, but only as my best friend Caleb's older brother, the guy who'd tease us mercilessly when we were kids in suburban Ohio, building forts in their backyard. Back then, he was just a shadow in the background, always leaving for football practice or sneaking out to parties we were too young to understand. Now, at 24, he was different, taller, sharper, with a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavier. I was 19, fresh off a brutal breakup with my high school boyfriend, Mark, who'd called me a mistake in front of half the town. The memory still stung, like salt in a wound I couldn't stop picking at. Caleb was out of town for a college internship in Chicago, leaving me to face the summer in our sleepy town of Willow Creek alone. I'd been dodging whispers and sidelong glances ever since Mark's public outburst at the county fair, where he'd shouted that I'd tricked him into dating me, as if my being gay was some kind of con. The diner, with its chipped mugs and flickering neon sign, was my refuge. But even here, I felt exposed. Ethan showing up felt like a lifeline, but the way his gaze lingered made me wonder if I was ready to grab it. "You don't have to talk," Ethan said, leaning back, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "But I'm here." His voice was steady, but there was something else, a flicker of something unspoken. I wanted to ask what he meant, why he was here at all, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. We sat in silence for a while, the jukebox playing some old Springsteen tune. Ethan didn't push, didn't ask about Mark or the rumors. He just stayed, his presence solid, like he'd decided I wasn't facing this alone anymore. I didn't know then that this moment, his quiet offer, that look in his eyes, would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. The diner's clock ticked past midnight, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. Ethan leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You ever feel like you're running from something, but you don't know what?" I froze. It was like he'd reached into my chest and pulled out the truth I'd been hiding, even from myself. I nodded, barely, and he smiled, a small, sad thing that made my chest ache. He told me about his own battles, things I'd never known. How he'd left Willow Creek after high school, chasing a football scholarship, only to crash and burn when he realized he didn't fit into the world of locker room bravado. "I was hiding," he said, staring at his hands. "From who I am. From what I wanted." His eyes met mine again, and the air shifted, like the moment before a storm breaks. I didn't ask what he meant. I wasn't ready. But as we left the diner, his shoulder brushing mine as we stepped into the damp night, I felt something stir a spark, dangerous and alive. I didn't know if I was ready for it, but I knew I didn't want it to fade. The next few days were a blur of texts and stolen moments. Ethan would show up at the diner, or we'd drive out to the lake, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about the guys he'd dated in secret, the fear that had kept him quiet in a town like ours. I told him about Mark, about the shame that clung to me like damp clothes. With every word, the walls I'd built started to crack. One night, under a sky thick with stars, we sat on the hood of his truck, the world quiet except for the crickets. "You're not a mistake, Jamie," he said, his voice fierce. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you are." His hand grazed mine, and for the first time in months, I didn't pull away. I wanted to hold on, to see where this could go, but fear gnawed at me. What if this was just another heartbreak waiting to happen? The summer heat pressed down on Willow Creek, thick and unrelenting, But with Ethan, it felt bearable. We'd fallen into a rhythm: late-night drives, quiet talks at the diner, moments where our hands would brush and linger a second too long. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, but I couldn't stop leaning toward it. Caleb came back for a weekend, oblivious to the shift between his brother and me. We were at their house, sprawled on the living room couch, when Caleb started teasing me about my moping phase. "You're looking less like a kicked puppy lately," he said, tossing a chip at me. Ethan, leaning against the doorway, caught my eye and smirked, like we shared a secret. My face burned, and I prayed Caleb didn't notice. That night, after Caleb crashed, Ethan found me on the back porch, staring at the fireflies. "You okay?" he asked, sitting close enough that our knees touched. I wanted to tell him I was and that I was scared of how much I was starting to feel, how much I wanted him to keep looking at me like I was something worth seeing. Instead, I just nodded, and he didn't push. He never did. But the town wasn't as kind. Word got around that Ethan and I were spending time together, and the whispers grew louder. At the gas station, I overheard two guys from my old high school muttering about Caleb's fag brother and how I was following in his footsteps. My stomach twisted, but when I told Ethan, he just shrugged. "Let him talk," he said. "They're just noise." But I saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his fists clenched. He wasn't as unaffected as he pretended. We started being more careful, meeting at out-of-the-way Placise clearing in the woods, an old barn on the edge of town. It felt like we were stealing moments, and every one made my heart race faster. One evening, in the barn's dusty loft, Ethan kissed me. It was sudden, soft, and then desperate, like we'd both been holding our breath for too long. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he whispered, his forehead against mine. I couldn't speak, couldn't think past the warmth of his hands, the way he made me feel whole. But secrets don't stay secret in Willow Creek. A week later, someone spray-painted a slur on Ethan's truck. He laughed it off, scrubbing it clean with a rag and some paint thinner. But I saw the hurt in his eyes. "This is why I left," he said, tossing the rag aside. "But I'm not running anymore." His voice was steady, but it cracked on the last word, and I realized he was as scared as I was. I started pulling back, terrified of what we were stirring up. The town's judgment felt like a weight I couldn't shake, and I didn't want to drag Ethan down with me. But he wouldn't let me go that easily. One night, he showed up at my house, eyes blazing. "You don't get to decide what I can handle, Jamie," he said. "I'm in this." "Are you?" I didn't have an answer. Not then. All I knew was that I couldn't imagine him walking away. The days grew shorter, but the tension in Willow Creek only thickened. Ethan and I were caught in a fragile dance, stealing glances, hiding from prying eyes, pretending we weren't falling deeper every time we were alone. But the town was closing in, and I could feel its judgment like a noose tightening around us. Caleb started to suspect something. He caught us laughing too long at a stupid joke in the diner, our hands brushing as we reached for the same fry. "What's with you two?" he asked, half joking, but his eyes narrowed. I mumbled something about just hanging out, but Ethan didn't flinch. "We're friends," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Friends." The word felt like a lie, but I didn't correct him. Not in front of Caleb. Later, alone by the lake, I asked Ethan why he didn't tell Caleb the truth. "He's your brother. He'd get it, right?" Ethan stared at the water, his jaw tight. "He might. But I've spent years keeping this part of me from him. It's not that easy." I wanted to argue, to say we shouldn't have to hide, but the memory of Mark's betrayal off the town turning on me kept me quiet. Then came the festival. Willow Creek's annual harvest fair was the kind of event where everyone showed up, pretending to be one big happy family. Ethan and I went together, trying to act casual, but every laugh, every glance felt like a risk. Halfway through the night, Mark showed up, drunk and loud, with a group of his old football buddies. He spotted me by the Ferris wheel and sauntered over, his grin sharp as a blade. Still chasing after guys. Huh, Jamie. He slurred, loud enough for the crowd to turn. My face burned, but before I could respond, Ethan stepped in front of me. Walk away, Mark, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Mark laughed, but there was fear in his eyes. He muttered something ugly and stumbled off, his friends trailing behind. The crowd dispersed, but the damage was done. People were staring, whispering. I wanted to disappear, but Ethan grabbed my hand, his grip steady. Don't let him win, he said, and for a moment, I believed I could be brave. That night, we drove to the clearing in the woods, the stars sharp above us. Ethan was quiet, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I'm tired of hiding, he said finally. But I'm not going to push you. You decide what you want. His words hit hard. I wanted him more than I'd ever wanted anything but the fear of losing everything, of becoming the town's punching bag again, held me back. I kissed him instead of answering, pouring everything I couldn't say into it. He kissed me back, fierce and unyielding, and for a moment, the world didn't exist. But as we pulled apart, the weight of reality settled back in. I knew we couldn't keep this up forever, not without a cost. The air in Willow Creek felt heavier after the festival, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to break. Ethan and I kept meeting in secret, but every stolen moment felt like borrowing time. I was falling for him, and it scared me as much as it thrilled me. Caleb confronted me a week later. We were at the diner, the same booth where Ethan had first sat across from me. You and Ethan, he said, his voice low, like he was piecing together a puzzle. Something's going on, isn't it? My mouth went dry. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. We're just close, I managed. Caleb's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he'd push harder. But he just nodded, his expression unreadable, and changed the subject. Ethan was less cautious. He started holding my hand in public, just for a second, or standing closer than he needed to. It was reckless, but it made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt since before Mark. One afternoon, we were at the lake, skipping stones across the water, when he turned to me, his eyes serious. I want to tell Caleb, he said. I want to tell everyone. I'm done pretending. I froze. The idea of being out, of facing the town's judgment together, was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if it ruins everything? I asked. What if Caleb hates us? Ethan's face softened, and he pulled me close. He's my brother. He'll come around. And if he doesn't, we'll figure it out. Together. His certainty was a lifeline, but I wasn't sure I could hold on. That night, someone threw a brick through the diner's window. Scrawled across it in red paint was a single word, fags. The diner's owner, MS. Ellie, a tough old woman who'd always been kind to me, called the police, but they shrugged it off as kids being kids. Ethan was furious, his hands shaking as he helped clean up the glass. This is what they do, he said. They try to scare you into silence. I wanted to be as brave as he was, but all I could think about was how small I felt, how exposed. We didn't tell Caleb about the brick, but he heard anyway. Small towns talk. He showed up at my house the next day, his face pale. Is this because of you and Ethan? he asked. I couldn't lie. Not anymore. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't yell, didn't storm out. He just looked at me, hurt flickering in his eyes, and left without another word. I thought I'd lost him. And maybe Ethan, too. Because if Caleb couldn't accept us, how could we keep going? The silence from Caleb was deafening. For days, he didn't answer my texts, didn't show up at the diner. Ethan tried to stay strong, but I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he kept checking his phone for messages that never came. We were caught in a limbo, wanting each other but afraid of what it was costing. The town didn't let up. Graffiti appeared on the high school bleachers. More slurs aimed at us. Ethan's truck got keyed, deep scratches carving jagged lines across the paint. He didn't bother fixing it this time, just drove it like a badge of defiance. They don't get to win, he told me, but his voice was strained, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I started avoiding the diner, the lake, anywhere I might run into Mark or his friends. But Ethan wouldn't let me hide. He dragged me to the old barn one night, a blanket tucked under his arm. We lay in the loft, staring at the stars through a hole in the roof, and he told me stories, silly ones about his high school pranks, sad ones about the guys he'd loved and lost. I don't want to lose you, Jamie, he said, his hand finding mine. No matter what. I wanted to believe him, to believe we could outlast the hate. But doubt was a constant shadow. What if this was all we'd ever have, stolen moments in a crumbling barn, always looking over our shoulders? I didn't say it out loud, but Ethan seemed to hear it anyway. He kissed me, slow and deliberate, like he was promising something neither of us could fully trust. Then Caleb called. His voice was quiet, strained, when he asked us to meet him at the house. My stomach churned as we walked up the porch steps, Ethan's hand brushing mine for courage. Caleb was in the living room, his eyes red like he hadn't slept. I don't get it, he said, looking between us. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan started to explain, but Caleb cut him off. Not you. Jamie. You're my best friend. You should have trusted me. The hurt in his voice was worse than any slur. I tried to apologize, to explain the fear, but the words felt hollow. Ethan stepped in, his voice steady. It's my fault, too. I didn't want to lose you, Caleb. But I'm not losing Jamie, either. The room went quiet, the weight of his words settling over us. Caleb didn't respond, just nodded and walked out, leaving us in the wreckage of what we'd tried to protect. Caleb's silence stretched into weeks, and it carved a hole in me I didn't know how to fill. Ethan and I clung to each other, our moments together a mix of defiance and desperation. We'd drive out of town, to places where no one knew us, where we could hold hands without looking over our shoulders. But even those escapes felt temporary, like we were just delaying the inevitable. The town's anger wasn't subtle anymore. Someone slashed Ethan's tires outside the diner. An MS. Ellie started getting complaints about undesirables hanging around her place. She didn't Koresh seen worse in her 60 years, but it made me feel like a burden. Ethan, though, was unshaken. They're scared of us, he said one night, his voice fierce. Because we're not hiding anymore. I wanted to match his courage, but fear was a weight I couldn't shake. One evening, we were at the clearing when Ethan pulled out a letter he'd written to Caleb. I'm sending it tomorrow, he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. The letter was raw, honest, everything he'd never said about who he was, who he loved. He deserves to know, Ethan said. And so do you. He handed me a second letter, addressed to me. I didn't read it then, I couldn't, but I tucked it into my pocket, my heart pounding. The next day, Mark and his friends cornered me outside the hardware store. They didn't touch me, but their words were sharp, cutting into every insecurity I tried to bury. "You're gonna ruin Ethan's life," Mark sneered. "Just like you ruined mine." I wanted to fight back, to tell him he didn't know me, but all I could do was walk away, their laughter ringing in my ears. That night, I read Ethan's letter. It was a confession, a promise every fear he'd ever had, every hope he held for us. "I'm all in, Jamie," he'd written. "No matter what it costs." Tears blurred the words, and I realized I couldn't keep running from him. I called him, my voice shaking, and told him I was ready. Ready to be us, out in the open, no matter what. We decided to tell Caleb together. We found him at the lake, skipping stones like we used to as kids. He looked at us, his expression unreadable, and I braced for the worst. But then he spoke, his voice soft. "I just needed time," he said. "I'm not mad. I'm just figuring it out." It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. But it was a start. Caleb's words gave us a sliver of hope. But Willow Creek wasn't done with us. The harassment escalated. Anonymous notes left on Ethan's truck. More graffiti on the diner's walls. MS. Ellie started keeping a baseball bat behind the counter, her jaw set like she was ready for war. "You boys are family," she told us. "Don't let the bastards grind you down." Her support was a lifeline, but it couldn't stop the town's venom. Ethan and I decided to stop hiding. We walked into the diner hand in hand one evening, the room going quiet as eyes turned to us. My heart pounded, but Ethan's grip was steady, his smile defiant. "Let him stare," he whispered. We sat in our usual booth, ordered coffee, and acted like the world wasn't watching. It felt like freedom, even if it was fleeting. Caleb started coming around, slowly. He'd join us at the diner, awkward at first, but his presence was a bridge we were desperate to cross. One night, he brought up the past, how he'd missed the signs, how he wished we'd trusted him sooner. "I'm not perfect," he said, "but I'm trying." It was enough. For now. Mark wasn't done, though. He showed up at the diner one night, drunk and angry, shouting about how we were ruining the town. Ethan stood up, calm but unyielding, and told him to leave. Mark swung at him, a clumsy punch that missed, but the fight spilled outside. I pulled Ethan back before it could escalate, but the damage was done. The crowd outside was a mix of support and hostility, and I realized we couldn't stay in Willow Creek forever, not like this. That night, Ethan and I made a plan. We'd save up, leave town, start somewhere new. It wasn't running. Not exactly. It was choosing a life where we could breathe. We told Caleb, expecting him to pull away, but he just nodded. "I'll visit," he said, a small smile breaking through. "You're not getting rid of me that easy." The idea of leaving was bittersweet. Willow Creek was home, with all its flaws, but it was also a cage. Ethan and I spent our last weeks stealing every moment we could, kisses in the barn, drives under the stars, promises whispered in the dark. We were building something stronger than the town's hate, something worth fighting for. Leaving Willow Creek felt like shedding a skin that never fit right. Ethan and I packed up his truck, our belongings stuffed into duffel bags, our hearts heavy but hopeful. Caleb stood on the porch as we loaded the last box, his eyes wet but his smile genuine. "You better call me," he said, pulling us both into a hug. It was the first time I felt like we might all be okay. We drove west, toward a small city in Oregon where Ethan had a friend who'd promised us a place to crash. The road stretched out, endless and open, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and we didn't let go for miles. The new city wasn't perfect. We found a tiny apartment. Worked odd jobs, Ethan at a garage, me at a coffee shop. There were still whispers, still glances, but they didn't carry the same weight. We were building a life, one where we could walk down the street hand in hand, where our love wasn't a secret to be guarded. Caleb visited a month later, his laughter filling our cramped living room as he told stories about Willow Creek's latest dramas. He'd started talking to Ms. Ellie, helping her repaint the diner's walls, covering the scars of the past. The town's changing, he said. Slowly. But it's something. I believed him, not because Willow Creek was perfect, but because people like Caleb were trying. One night, under a sky so clear it felt like a gift, Ethan and I sat on our apartment's fire escape, the city humming below. He pulled out the letter I'd never finished reading, the one he'd written months ago. "Read it now," he said, his voice soft. I did, and every word was a promise of love, of strength, of a future we'd fight for together. Tears fell, but they were the good kind. The kind that come when you realize you're exactly where you're meant to be. We weren't naive. The world wasn't done challenging us, and there'd be days when the weight of it would feel too heavy. But as I looked at Ethan, his eyes reflecting the city lights, I knew we'd face it together. Love like our shard won. Defiant. Real was worth every battle. And in that moment, with his hand in mine, I knew we'd already won.